of May 3rd, 2021 to order. And Ms. Hunt, would you take the attendance?
Mr. Carter?
Present.
Mr. Young?
Here.
Mr. Walters?
Here.
Ms. Cleland McGrath?
Here.
Ms. Moulton?
Here.
Mr. McDougall? Mr. Miller?
Here.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. At this time, I'm going to go to agenda item number 2, which is an executive session. We're going into executive session for approximately 15 minutes for potential litigation per RCW 42.30.110.1I. So at this time, council, if you will go out of this meeting and go into the executive session, and we'll return shortly. people? All right. Well, good evening, everyone. I'll bring us back into session. We have come out of executive session for litigation and no action was taken. And at this time, I will go into item number 3 on our agenda, which is announcements and committee reports. And item 3A is our COVID-19 update. And as per the governor's roadmap to recovery plan, counties are individually evaluated every 3 weeks. The evaluations are occurring today, and we expect to hear about the phase changes tomorrow. These changes will go into effect this Friday, May 7th. Counties across Washington state are experiencing a spike in cases of COVID and hospital admissions. Case rates are increasing across all ages, except people 70 years and older. And that is a group, of course, that are fully vaccinated. In Skagit County, the case rates are presently at 228.4 new cases per 100,000 population over the last 14 days. This is the highest rate we've seen since last January. Skagit County is also experiencing an influx of new COVID-19 hospitalization rates that are above the state's requirement to stay in phase 3 of reopening. About 107,000 residents of Skagit have received at least 1 dose of the COVID-19 vaccination. And as of Friday, 32% of the Skagit County population was fully vaccinated. We in Skagit County, as of yesterday, we had 4,900 positive COVID cases. We had 67 deaths and 313 people hospitalized. They're estimated in the 98221 area code. The cases remain between 400 and 419 people. Island Hospital's numbers, they've tested over 15,000 people with the total positive cases of 314, and we've admitted 57 to Island Hospital, and we've had no fatalities. In Washington State, we now are at over 406,000 cases of COVID, 5,499 deaths. In the United States, we have 32.4 million cases and 577,000 deaths. Worldwide, 153 million confirmed cases of COVID-19, including 3.2 million deaths. And that's reported to us by the World Health Organization. So for tomorrow, we will be waiting to hear from the governor with the expectation that we may be rolled back to phase 2. And that concludes my report today. Any questions? Okay, we'll move on to item 3B, which is our Finance Committee report.
Mayor Gear.
Yes, Mr. Walters.
The Finance Committee has been working on a format and approach for a council retreat on the budget. The mayor has endorsed this concept of a budget retreat, tentatively scheduled, I think now for May 27th. You all got from Alexandra some requests for availability. At the moment, based on what we expect COVID restrictions are, we're thinking it will be 2 hours and via Zoom. We were trying for something that could maybe be outdoors, maybe be in person, but we currently think that we're going to be restricted to that. And if we're restricted to Zoom, then we don't want to go more than 2 hours, and I assume that council would agree. Our objectives and deliverables for this meeting are to work through laying the groundwork and laying out the bookends for the budget. So before we get into the specifics of the many meetings that we go through looking at an actual budget, we thought what would be useful to provide to the mayor in advance of assembling that budget is what council members are looking for. Maybe a council member, and so this is just some examples brainstormed to get you attuned to the brass tacks. Maybe a council member is looking to fund ER&R, again, refund it to 100% within the next X number of years. Or maybe a council member is wanting to know when we can reasonably build a fire station and commit to saving money so that we can build that fire station within X number of years. Maybe we want to decide how we are going to deal with the pending utility tax decline, the decline in revenue from utility tax that we are already seeing. Those types of things, bigger picture type items that affect how the entire budget is assembled. Those are the things that are our objectives for this type of retreat. Now, these are our ideas from the Council Finance Committee, but it really does take a head nod from Council overall, I think, to decide to move forward with this. But in addition to those objectives, what we were hoping to get Council members to do is to provide their brainstormed priorities in a memo or an email, not particularly long, no more than 1 page, that could be provided to Mr. Hoagland so that he could distribute them to department heads sometime in the next week. A generalized call for ideas, priorities, and values from council members, things that would inform the budget assembly process, not just capital projects, although maybe capital projects are a big part of that. Those memos would go to Mr. Hoagland. They would get distributed to the mayor and the department heads. They would then inform memos that the department heads would produce as to what they're thinking about they need in next year's budget. And then we would hash all of that out at the retreat. So none of these things would be taken as gospel until such time as the mayor endorses them for her proposed budget. But they would be information that the mayor could use in determining how to proceed. So this is intended to head off some of what we encountered last year, where the mayor's proposed budget didn't fully fund, say, the pavement management program. If council really wants to pave, to fund the pavement management program at its full amount, then the mayor would know that from council before she goes to assemble the budget. Because so many pieces of the budget will have to move around in order to accomplish that. It really makes sense to have that information up front. So what our committee is asking for as a head nod from council is for that generalized approach. It's fairly fluid, but it would require individual council members to generate an email to Mr. Hoagland by, say, next Monday, so that he could then start working with that and distribute it and take the next steps. How does that sound?
I like it. I do.
Mayor Gear, you're muted.
The only thing I would add to that is we talked about it this morning at the Monday morning directors meeting, and we thought maybe 9 to noon, and not that we would go till noon, but if it went beyond 11, we'd have some wiggle room. Just so if you see a posting, that was the only other suggestion that was made. We thought it was better to have a longer period of time posted because it will be a public meeting, and we want to have adequate time to take care of whatever, but not too much either. Thank you. Any other?
So then I think Mr. Hoagland will send out a message to council members, and then maybe also a reminder so that we get those in about a week.
Right.
He'll also be preparing a presentation based on some of the stuff that he's presented before, but reminders about the structure of the budget, revenue sources, numbers, and those kinds of things that we'll hopefully have in advance of the meeting.
All right, any other comments? All right, we'll move on now to item 3C, which is our Lodging Tax Advisory Committee report. Mr. Miller.
Thanks, Mayor. The Lodging Tax Advisory Committee held a special meeting because it's not in the normal cycle. We typically meet in the fall for items for the following year. But we had a special meeting on Thursday, I think, last week. And the discussion was about funding for additional parklets. We had a request from 2 businesses for 2 more parklets. the lodging, and that'll still come before council in a more formal approval process. But it did generate a lot of discussion amongst the committee at what point is too many. So the committee supported the addition of 2 parklets for 2 more restaurants. But then, no surprise, after the meeting, a couple days after the meeting, another business requested a parklet. So it kind of drove, the discussion was already centered about, okay, how many parklets is the right amount? How much is the lodging tax committee willing to spend on parklets? And what's the post-COVID plan for the parklets to include parking? Again, I think everybody accepts that the main philosophy behind spending that capital LTAC funds was to help specifically restaurants and those types of establishments that are very much restricted on currently in phase 3, 50% capacity. However, outside it's just a 6-foot limit. There isn't a number restriction. So I think the council all supported that to get those parklets out right away. But there will be a time where we're going to have to think about managing. Every single business can't have a free parklet essentially. So there was a lot of discussion about that. So I think 2 is going to be fine from the lodging tax. But if we go back and ask for additional, we're going to have a little more plan from the city about what's the way forward. And there was some good ideas. I won't go through all those now. But basically, there are 11 out there purchased by the city by lodging tax funds. 2 were made by the businesses themselves and just authorized to be there. So additional 2, I think that would take it to 14 total city-owned parklets if these are approved by formal council action, probably in the next week or so. So I think that was all we had from that 30-minute meeting.
Mayor, you're on mute, but I'm assuming you gave me the
Go
approval.
ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I know this may not be the time to bring it up, but I just thought that since we were talking about how we would also help downtown businesses recover and thrive, there was some discussion of, for the weekend, making downtown roadway one way. And that's come up a number of times again. So I just wanted to put that on the table for a future discussion as we look at what we might be able to do to help downtown thrive and move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Young. Any other comments on this? All right, we'll move on then to item 3D, which is our Public Works Committee report.
Mayor Gear?
Ms. Moore?
Thank you. We had a Public Works Committee meeting prior to this meeting. It was Mr. Young, Mr. Walters, and I, also with staff, Becky Fox, the wastewater treatment plant manager, Mr. Buckenmeyer, and also Mr. McDaniel, who's at the water treatment plant. So we talked a lot about water and wastewater treatment. One of the important things coming before council very soon is the universe of options of how we want to proceed in handling our wastewater and solids, the solids from that upcoming. And we've talked about hydrothermal liquefaction, which is a new technology that staff has been excited about. And we will be receiving 17 options on May 17th from Brown and Caldwell. And we need to narrow those down to the most desirable, the most feasible for our needs. One thing that's happening around the same time as this is that there is grant funding available from the Department of Energy, and it would cover up to 50% of the cost of the hydrothermal liquefaction treatment system if we decided to go in that direction. So there's a time crunch. We have 17 options coming before us, but if we do want to pursue hydrothermal liquefaction, the grant application, which is about 150 pages, is due June 21st. So we're going to get this sort of condensed timeline, but we know we can do it. So we'll get the options on May 17th. And then in the following week, with the help of the consultants, who will help us determine our priorities, they'll come before us again. And as a council, we'll decide. This is a very big decision that we will all take part in. Also, there's funding from the Department of Ecology. They have a green reserve revolving loan fund, which would cover an additional 25% of the cost. So potentially, if we qualified for funding, we could get 75% of that paid for. The other aspect of that right now is that Ms. Fox has reached out to Marathon, and they are interested in the biocrude products that would result from this treatment system. So that's pretty exciting also. So there's potential for a revenue stream from us selling the results, and also we'd be able to handle more. Anyway, we'll talk about all those details later, but there's a lot going on, and it's fascinating. In addition to that, our incinerator needs replacement. The compliance is costly and labor intensive, and the regulations continue to get more challenging to meet. So there's been a lot of money poured into the incinerator, and it's getting harder and harder to comply with the regulations. So that's going on. After that, we talked about the brand new raw water clear well that will start to be filled on Thursday and tested to make sure it's all good so we can decommission the old one and start the new one. There's also a sizable change order coming from that project due to Dike District 12's requirements. It's going to, staff's going to come to council with a $182,000 change order that resulted from requirements that the Dike District let the city know about partway through the project. So that's coming forward, and we'll vote on that. The third thing we talked about are the school zone signs that were put up around the city school zones in the last 4 or 5 years that had electronic issues and failures right from the beginning. So there hasn't been support from the manufacturer of those. We can't get parts for them. So the idea is to take them out after the end of the school year this year, and then we'll need new ones. So it looks like it'd be about $110,000 to cover all the schools and city limits. That doesn't include Fidalgo, but all the other schools. And so we'll need to get some funding for those. There is also some revisions that on Sharp's Corner, the roundabout, that WashDOT is going to do. They have definitely improved the conditions are improved. I think we can all agree at the roundabout from the previous intersection. And the severity of the accidents has notably decreased, but the rate of accidents is not where it should be. So there are diagrams that were sent to the city. So one of the lanes, you guys probably don't want all of these details, but when you're leaving Anacortes and you're eastbound, and there are the 2 lanes coming westbound, and then 2 lanes going toward Burlington. Anyway, that's where all the accidents seem to be happening. So WashDOT wants to turn that part into 1 lane that's in the roundabout, so it will be less hazardous. Okay, I'm going to try to wrap this up here. The last thing is really good news about our avenue. It was an interdepartmental cooperation between Public Works and Parks. Will Ludeman is the Public Works Operations Supervisor, and he took the lead on this. And he and Nicole Johnston of the Parks Department combined forces to clean up the R Avenue corridor. They mowed, they edged, they cleared off the sidewalk, and they just beautified it. Did a great job. So next time you're on our avenue, look around because it looks fabulous. So, I have one more thing. The bid request has been sent out for the marine portion of the combined sewer outfall, and 4 contractors out of 10 met the request for qualifications. On May 13th, there will be a pre-bid meeting with the contractors, and then they'll put their bids in. So 4 qualified contractors will be bidding on that project. So thanks for bearing with me. That's it.
Very good report, Carolyn. Okay,
Here.
yes, go ahead.
Just to tag on a little bit on the school zone signs, this was not an anticipated expense. I mean, they've been a sort of a problem on and off forever. So Public Works will be looking for grants, but if somebody wants to privately contribute to be responsible for saving the lives of children in a school zone, I'm sure the city would be helpful in putting a funder together with a school zone sign. They are fairly expensive, and we do need a lot of them, but they're really effective.
Thank you, Mr. Walters. All right, at this time, I'm going to move on to item 4, which is public comment. And if you have any comments to make to the council of things that are not on the agenda, it's your opportunity to speak at this time. Raise your hand if you'd like to make a public comment to the council on anything not on the agenda. All right, I don't see any hands raised. So we'll move on to item 5, our consent agenda, items A through D.
Mayor Gear,
Mr. Miller,
I move to approve consent agenda items A through D.
Second.
Walters. We have a motion by Mr. Miller, a second by Mr. Walters. Is there any discussion? All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Motion carries. At this time, we're going to item 6, which is a public hearing, and we have 2 items this evening. We're going to go to item 6A, which is a continued public hearing on Ordinance 3087, vacating the right-of-way of a portion of 11th Street adjacent to the blocks 242 and 243 of the map of the city of Anacortes, together with the west 10 feet of B Avenue adjacent to Lot 1 of Block 243. This is a discussion with possible action, and Ms. Swetnam will lead the discussion. Thank you, Ms. Swetnam.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I won't say too much about this but I thought I would just share a copy of the map
Mayor Gear.
Okay.
Mayor Gear, I'm sorry to interrupt, but Darcy, it's very difficult to hear you. I don't know if other people are experiencing the same thing. I see head nods.
Okay. How about that? Is that better?
A little.
Okay. My apologies. I'm not sure why there's an issue. But I will speak
That's better.
louder. Okay, I will speak louder. So tonight I just wanted to put up a copy of the map that staff presented last time. As a reminder, the vacation petition that's before council right now proposes to vacate 4 separate sections of right-of-way. Sections 2 and 3 are at the end of 11th Street. The north section of 11th Street is proposed to be vacated in favor of the Wynn Family Trust. Section 3 is the south half of 11th Street, proposed to be vacated in favor of the Ortman Family LLCs. And then segments 4 and 5 are the 10-foot strips along B Avenue, also proposed to be vacated in favor of the Ortman families. And the consideration for all of this is that the Wynn family proposes to convey to the city an easement across their property that the city can then use for trail purposes. And Mayor has already opened the public hearing, so I just wanted to recap that. I'm happy to answer questions.
All right, council, do you have questions to start of Ms. Swetnam or about the project? All right. So should I go to public comment or?
Madam, would you like me to leave this map up, or I'm happy to stop sharing so council can see speakers?
Yeah, let's do it so you can see the speakers, and then we can always bring the map back up.
Sure.
All right. Okay, council, any thoughts before I open it up for public comment? All right, members of the audience, does anyone like to address the council before they deliberate this evening? If so, please raise your hand. All right, I have Sean. And you may go ahead and speak.
Hi, Mayor, City Council. Good evening. My name is Sean Nerona at 1117 B Avenue. I'd like to make it clear that I do not support this vacation as it is written. There are numerous inconsistencies that have been brought up by several individuals, many with significant experience in public planning, municipal code, and various other facets related to this vacation that I do not believe have been fully addressed. Brian Wetcher's comments are but the latest that bring into doubt the process and leads me to believe that this proposal has not been thought out fully. I believe that the Grimace Channel Trail is a wonderful concept. There is significant potential for negative precedent to be set in this vacation request. And I don't know if the city has fully considered the ramifications. In his public comment, Brian states that the easement acquired by this vacation is one of the many necessary to complete the section of Grimace Channel right of way. This process will set a precedent applicable to all such future easements in this section of the trail, as well as others where private property easements are necessary to complete the trail. The ambiguities represented by the consolidation of this vacation request represent a lack of clarity within the process best remedied by the separation of the easements into two separate requests. The precedent of eliminating localized public shoreline access in exchange for the trail easement defeats the purpose of neighborhood connections to the trail, which is best remedied by retaining a pedestrian right-of-way, as he had earlier indicated in his public comment. In closing, I urge you to work with the neighborhood instead of pushing through with only minimal consideration. Address these concerns with the proper thought to hopefully mitigate the second and potentially third order effects for future generations in this neighborhood and in the city writ large.
Thank you. All right. Sorry, just a moment. I'm having trouble with my screen. Can you come help me? I'm not seeing where.
We're sharing over here. Yeah, okay. Disable him. I'll see anyone else's hand.
Okay, do we have anyone else that would like to speak? Members of the audience? No other.
Yeah, Rebecca. Still allowed to talk.
Oh, God. Where?
This one. There you go. Put it back in here.
Where?
Mhm.
Just do it. I'm just.
And Rebecca's ready to go.
Okay, Rebecca, you may speak. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor Gear. Hello, everyone. My name is Rebecca Ivy, and I live on 11th Street. I want to encourage the City Council to vote no on this proposal. Giving 10 by 80 feet of B Avenue to the Ortmans violates the City Council approved code. Basically, saying yes to this proposal would be breaking the city's own rules that you established. There is also the issue of the Ortmans having already received a portion of 11th Street in 2009 in exchange for their waterfront property. Through this deal, the current deal, they would be getting more city land, having given nothing and spent $0. We have been told repeatedly that they are involved in this proposal because they agreed not to oppose the Wynn vacation if given more city land. This seems to be another way of saying that they would oppose the proposal if not given what they want. The last time the city gave them land, they abused that right by blocking a view corridor and a street end. It's my belief that the decision made in 2009 was a mistake. It was a different city council then and a different mayor who presided over that decision to allow the vacation of a street end and view corridor in Old Town. While it is a little late to somehow rectify that mistake, I would hope that this council doesn't make that mistake again or make that original mistake that much worse. I realize how important the trail is to all of you. The trail is popular and you were elected as pro-trail candidates. You want to live up to your promises, which is understandable, but I feel this is a bad deal. If this proposal is approved, it will set an unfortunate precedent. I guess the main question is the concept of the trail, the possibility of it, more important than the neighborhoods it may someday go through? Thank you all for your time and energy on this issue. I appreciate you coming out for the site visit to see it in person. Thanks.
All right, members of the audience, is there anyone else that would like to speak to us this evening on this? All right, I don't see any other hands. So council, I'm going to bring it back to you.
Mayor Gear.
Yeah, Mr. McDougall.
Question from Ms. Swetnam. Ms. Ivy made reference to city code that may actually state that this particular vacation is not allowed, or it would be that there's some code that kind of prohibits a portion of this vacation. Do you have information on that?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. There is so this agreement with these property owners was under discussion for the past couple of years. And during that period of time, last year, council adopted an update to Chapter 1250, which is the section of city code that addresses vacations. And there was language adopted into the code that prohibits the vacation of a portion of right-of-way, meaning something less than the full width of the right-of-way. And there can be an exception found if council issues a finding in an ordinance that the entire width of the road cannot be vacated, and also speaks to how the proposal addresses the factors that are laid out in section 1250.060. So I think the question before council about whether the B Avenue portion of it can be vacated, because there haven't been any cases where these types of proposals have come to council since that new code has been adopted, is whether this is a situation that council believe that section prohibits the city from moving forward with.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mayor Gear. Mayor Gear.
Mary,
Mr. Walters, go ahead.
I think that the proposed vacation of the end of 11th, as Mr. McDougall read from me 2 weeks ago, and as it seemed to me back in December, is fairly common sense and a good deal for the city. If we're working and engaged in this project of building the Squeamish Channel Trail, this type of arrangement, I think, makes good sense. Parking in neighborhoods, essentially trailheads in neighborhoods for motor vehicles, is going to be an issue as we develop the trail. We really need to be sensitive to those issues. We need to be respectful of neighborhoods. The strength of them is the heart of Anacortes. So the vacation of 11th deals with that issue, and I understand that's the intent of the WINS, to deal with that issue by preventing the future use of that street end as essentially a parking lot. And this is the same neighborhood where parking lots in the neighborhood were a really big deal when there were proposals to develop the pier at the bottom of the bluff. The vacation of B Avenue, I think, is different. It really is not related to mitigating these trail issues. But most importantly, it just isn't permissible under our code. As Ms. Swetnam just mentioned, we have a code provision that prohibits a vacation petition unless it's for the entire width of the right-of-way to be vacated. And we put that into our code just a year ago because we had encountered situations where we vacated partially the right-of-way, and then it causes ambiguity and problems later. The exception in the code is if we adopt those findings that the vacation of the entire width is not possible. I think clearly it is possible if we really wanted to vacate the entirety of B. If we found in the alternative, then we would just be opening the door to vacation petitions from people. You know, a block could decide, well, I want 10 feet in front of my house, or 20 feet in front of my house. You know, if the right of way is 60 or 80 feet and we're not using it all, really, why not? And there are, I think, good public policy reasons to not vacate right of way. We don't know in the future what types of utilities we might want to put there. We don't know in a lot of places where a street might need to become an arterial 30, 40 years from now. And I think we would be handicapping the future if we started allowing these various changes to streets rather than preserving the uniform widths that are sort of the foundation of our street grid system and our utility system. So as I did 2 weeks ago, I proposed that we approve the ordinance presented, but with modification in that removing that segment number 4 and number 5, which are B Avenue. So we would only be approving the vacation of 11th. I think that makes a lot more sense, and I think it would be a good deal for the city.
Mayor Gear.
Mr. Miller.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I just wanted to maybe provide more background for a little more transparency. I think there was some good logic of having that B Avenue as part of the vacation deal because of the ordinance property. The orientation would make that a front, change the frontage, which we have different setbacks for that. But I think the remedy to that is if there's trouble with access, that the city could work some sort of variance issue. But again, so I think there's a remedy for that. And I also tend to agree that it's a good, I think it's still a good deal for everybody around that because we voted to change our vacation rules, that we need to protect our right of way. And I also support what Mr. Ryan was talking about as far as just being portions 2 and 3 or the blocks 242 and 243, not including the B Avenue vacation.
Mayor Gear?
Ms. Small.
I agree with Mr. Walters and Mr. Miller, especially in light of the changes to the code that we made last year, that it's not a good idea, in my opinion, to vacate that portion of B Avenue. And I agree that it's a good deal for the city to vacate the end of 11th in exchange for the easement. And I also believe it's a good deal for the property owners.
Mayor Gear?
Mr. Young.
Yes, I just wanted to echo the sentiment. I think that the concerns of the neighbors, as well as all of the letters, in particular, letters were very moving and really enlightening to just making sure that the public is heard. That's always been a concern of mine, is just to make sure that we hear the public. And I think that one of the points Ms. Swetnam made about, just how do we go about this? And I think that the greatest good for the public right now is the trail, if it can be done, feasibly done, reasonably, and still protect the environment. And I still think that we're on track for that. So I agree with the sentiment before. I do think that when we look at B, it is somewhat of a separate consideration from 11th. And so I'm, supportive.
Thank you. Ms. Cleland McGrath.
Thank you, Mayor Gear. I think the emphasis really needs to be the fact that it took 4 or 5 years, right, to get to this point. And during that time, our code was updated. So that's really a crucial factor as to why the number 4 and number 5 points on this map, there's been a change, because I think it's really important that council has confidence in the mayor and staff when working with property owners, that that you and staff have clear guidelines of what we expect, and if you bring something to us, that there's a high level of confidence that those property owners, what will happen that what is discussed kind of in intimate meetings will be supported by council. And I think we have a little bit more work to do in the next 6 months to a year to kind of help define, and as what Mr. Walter said, was some bookends of, you know, where are we going to try to have some access points? How are we going to, you know, find access points that fit within the neighborhood character? So they may just be pedestrian and bicycle access points, but not parking. So there's a little bit of history, and I can understand why the Ortmans, because of the change of frontage, requested the additional 10 feet. But it doesn't, unfortunately, at this point, it doesn't fit with our code. And there are some ways that we can accommodate it without doing a partial vacation. I do have one kind of technical question, and Darcy or Ms. Wetnam can probably answer it. You know, when we look at the map, the corner that's, you know, mid 11th Street is the western corner, right, or intersection. That accommodates that 10-foot easement that would be given for numbers 4 and 5. So would it make sense for us to scoot that west 10 feet? And does this make sense, right? So for lot number 3, it should go west. We should remove 10 feet and have those corners be 10 feet west of what we're seeing on that map. Does that make sense, or am I not interpreting that correctly? And is there work that we are going to have to accomplish if that's the direction we want to go?
That's a good question. I think I understand what you're saying. Whether we should move the easternmost border of vacation number 3 to the west 10 feet if we're not granting that 10 feet of B Avenue. I think if we did that, we would end up with a little orphan piece in the middle of that intersection. So I think that that easternmost boundary of vacations 2 and 3 line up with wait a minute, maybe I'm wrong. I think in any event, if council's inclined to move forward with vacating 11th Street and not B Avenue, staff will have to rework the ordinance and bring it back for council approval next week on the consent agenda. So I'm happy to touch bases with planning on that. I don't think it was our intention, if we had to come back with a separate vacation petition for 11th Street, that we would adjust the boundaries of those proposed vacations. And I think maybe that's because those lines line up with the property lines of the Wynn property. But I think that's a fair question that I would like to just touch bases with Mr. Meismer on before we put that into the ordinance.
Mayor Gear.
Mr. Miller.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the right of way of the 11th Street versus the right of way of B Avenue, and I'm pretty confident that the staff could figure that out pretty easily. Because it's, you know, whether it's the 11th Street right of way that takes it out to that line, or whether it's the 8th Street or B Avenue right of way.
Mayor Gear.
Mr. Walters.
And speaking only for myself, I'd be fine with leaving the legal descriptions of number 2 and number 3 as they are. I think it's sort of half dozen of one, 6 of another.
Mayor Gear.
Mr. McDougall.
Yeah, I'm fine with that as well, what Mr. Walters just said, and also I'm in agreement with the what sounds like general consensus here to that we're good with vacating 11th, but not those sections of B, and particularly because essentially the code change prohibits us from doing so.
Any other comments? So what I'm hearing right now is you are in favor of vacating the right-of-way of 11th Street, adjacent to blocks 242 and 243. And you are in favor of the staff bringing this back to you for approval or for a vote next week on the consent agenda. Can I get
Mayor Gear.
Mr. Walters?
It can't appear on consent because it needs a roll call vote as an ordinance,
Okay.
but otherwise, yes.
All right, I'll bring it back. Anything else?
Madam Mayor,
Ms. Swetnam?
One, if council is, if that's the kind of the decision, the direction that we're going, I might recommend that we close the public hearing.
I will do that. So at this time, is there any member of the audience that would like to say anything else on this? Okay, hearing nothing, I will close the public hearing on this, on ordinance 3087, and we'll return next week for council action. It will be on the agenda. Okay, great discussion. Thank you. Thank you, members of the audience and council. At this time, we'll move on to item 6B, which is also a continued public hearing on the critical areas regulation. This is draft 3. And I believe Ms. Tess Cooper or Mr. Don Meismer, are you going to introduce this tonight?
Thank you, Mayor, members of the council. I would appreciate that. Thank you. So this evening is draft 3 of the critical area regulations. And Ms. Cooper is going to go through some of the responses on comments that we've received. And again, as the mayor mentioned, this is a continued public hearing. And so with that, I'd like to introduce Ms. Tess Cooper to begin the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Meismer, and welcome, Ms. Cooper.
Thank you, Mayor Gear, City Council. Thank you for having me. I'm going to jump right into sharing my screen.
And before you start speaking, I might say we look at tonight as just another continuation of this public hearing, and we'll be coming back next week, and we could come back through the month of May to make sure we've incorporated everything that's important to our critical areas regulation. So I just want the audience to be aware of that. We have plenty of time to hear everyone and address every issue. Thank you, Ms. Cooper. You can proceed.
Absolutely. Very good clarification. Thank you. So continuing on our discussion of draft 3 critical area ordinance, we had the open public comment period on the draft that closed last Friday, or closed on April 23rd. Staff has compiled all of the comments received and compiled responses, and so that's what we'll go through tonight. We'll review the comments and discussions. I provided some good examples and figures and illustrations to talk about some of these concerns that were raised. The next item would be additional public hearing and testimony, if there's any folks that want to continue to speak. Again, as Mayor Gear noticed or mentioned, we will be working through this in additional meetings through the month of May. So we may either choose to close the hearing tonight or continue to leave it open through those additional meetings. That'll be City Council's choice. And then this evening, we'll have a final discussion from City Council on their thoughts for the discussion topics that we go over tonight. The current process that we are working through, again, the end of the public comment period for draft 3 was on April 23rd. Tonight, we're here to review the public comments and get additional directions from City Council members. We propose that next Monday night, May 10th, we come back and go through how it works and do some example case studies showing you different types of projects, wetlands, streams, buffer scenarios, and so forth, so you can see what we're talking about and what it all means. Then later on, we have the opportunity for additional discussion, final edits, and review of associated documents, and hopefully adoption. So tonight, this document was added to the packet this afternoon, and this is what we'll go through. It's a a matrix that lists all of the public comments that we received, the area or the key issue, the draft reference, as well as staff's response. Some of these are really good comments and staff recommends approval. Some of these are some misunderstandings or miscommunications that staff wants to clarify and try to help folks understand really what the intent and the outcome is going to be. And some of them are just comments to note. So with that, I'm going to bring up the document and we're just going to walk through it one by one. It's pretty long, but I think it'll go pretty fast. So we'll get a chance to stop and kind of discuss or ask questions on each of these if needed. So the first section is just general comments not associated with any specific section of the draft. We received one comment, and for those of you who received this, it was again added to the digital packet online. It will be added to the critical area ordinance page in the planning's website. When you get your copy of this, when you go through it on your own, again, they're listed by subject. A very brief summary of what the comment was is in this box. And then staff's comment here. If you want to see the actual, so there's a link to all of the comments on the page, but if you want to see the specific comment, you just click on the comment link and it will take you to that specific comment if you want to read more or get the actual context of what the comment was. So that's for your use later on as you review this again. So we received one comment about maps that points out that there are no known landslide areas along the Guimas Channel Trail that have not been included in the map. Staff noted this. Recent local information is not included in the data that we have compiled to make maps out of, but it is the idea to update draft maps along the way or adopted maps along the way as new data is collected. So all of the maps will be continued to be updated as new activities, new permits, new scientific reports come in. So if it's not included now and it is a known area, it will eventually be added to the map.
Mayor Gear. So
Mr. Walters.
I have a couple questions about exactly how this works. Are we proposing to adopt a particular map as part of the ordinance?
That's a good question. That's how it has occurred in the past. There's some confusion where to store those or where to refer back to the maps. Theoretically, the way it should work is that the maps will just go live in our GIS information. But we certainly can adopt a version of a map. But then again, with the constant editing and additions, that there's some trouble in tracking the adopted map in that way.
So it seems to me that we should talk about that, maybe not right now, but maybe a little later, because I do want to be able to distinguish between the features that the city council adopts by ordinance. You know, they can be adopted on paper or as a PDF and then translated into the GIS layer. But I want to be able to distinguish between what we adopt by ordinance and then what later gets added as new information comes along the way. And I want to have a lot of clarity about how that operates. So maybe we can bookmark that to return to.
Absolutely agreed, right? The intent was to adopt the PDF versions, but yes, there's definitely more discussion on how that works with live GIS updates. Thank you, Ryan. Okay. Next comment, protection for natural environments. Comment is concerned with protecting Anacortes natural environments and supports Evergreen Islands comments as submitted. And staff wants to thank you for your comment. We've noted your support of those comments. General protections for ecosystems. This comment discusses the intent of the critical area regulations to protect, maintain, and restore functions of ecosystems. And the commenter is disappointed that the critical area ordinance has provisions for developers with loopholes such as mitigation, reasonable use, and variances. Staff's response is that while there are many laws, regulations, and codes at the federal, state, and local levels that protect the environment and ecosystems that we can rely on and use, the purpose of the critical area ordinance is to specify what protections are required in relationship to development and construction permitting. So it's important that we have those provisions in here because that's the purpose of this regulatory body. Again, another general protections comment is in support of protecting our treasures, and they also support Evergreen Island's recommendations. And we've noted that. Another comment in support of Evergreen Islands' recommendation. Next, we have comments on our general provisions section. One comment regarding passive recreation. The commenter mentions that horses on trails in wet areas is not such a good idea. Maybe remove horseback riding. And that's 1970-040. The management of trails and trail uses is not relevant to this code. Those management practices will be regulated elsewhere in the parks and ACFL policies and Anacortes municipal code sections. This exempt activity language just means that the use of existing trails by any use is not regulated by the critical area ordinance. So eliminating particular uses doesn't mean that they're not exempt. All uses on existing trails are exempt. Those certainly can be discussed in a different area for what trails and uses are recommended. Another passive recreation comment, they're concerned with the language that has changed from does not include constructing new roads or trails, vegetation clearing, or collection of plants and animals, to the language we changed it to, which says, provided they do not require structures, grading, fill, drainage, or dredging. The commenter prefers the previous language that explicitly lists roads. Again, 1970-040 noted this concern. The new language preventing grading is expected to be more restrictive than just excluding new roads. Additionally, this section, again, only describes the fact that recreational activities do not require critical area development permits, as therefore an exempt activity. And building of new roads and new facilities would have to meet the standards for new roads and facilities and follow the proper permitting requirements. This comment is for protections. The comment acknowledges that the protections are improved for new development, but is concerned that the act of conversions of wetlands to landscaping on existing development, where there's no proposed construction, those activities are not protected. 1970-015 is the code reference. And conversion is a regulated alteration or development in and of itself, regardless of if there's associated construction. Therefore, even if no construction is occurring, conversion of a natural area to something different would be considered development and covered under this regulatory body. However, if this is confusing or we feel that there's a missing link here, staff suggests we add the word conversion to the applicability statement in 1970-015A. Next is identification and classification. Comment suggests that to ensure that buffer encroachments do not lead to reduced buffer delineations at a later date, the CAO needs to explicitly state the buffer requirements must be based on the pre-violation habitat condition of the wetland. Code reference 1970-020. The commenter made this recommendation previously, and it was already incorporated and added to draft 3 in section 1970-020C2. We felt it was a good recommendation, and it's already in draft 2. The goals section comments suggest that critical area baseline dates are significant and should be incorporated into the text. The goals section should be expanded to read goals and baseline dates. I had a hard time finding which draft, which code reference that should belong in. Further analysis of this is necessary if we want to consider this suggestion. Staff doesn't see a functional purpose in it, as baseline dates change with each new adoption for establishing legally existing non-conforming uses and structures. The main adoption date of incorporating a critical area ordinance in general is a good date, but every time there's a new update and adopted ordinance, there's a new date to track as to which regulations were. So we need to look at this a little bit more to see if we think it's necessary and to what that means and how to incorporate it with the different dates. Maps. Commenter shares knowledge on previous adopted maps, the nomenclature on those maps, and the adoption status under previous ordinances, as well as expresses concerns that establishing the burden of proof for wetland conditions for previous activities should be based on, or should be on, the applicant owner. So what this really is saying is that the previous maps established regulatory wetlands, and that if there's activities that don't match the maps, then the burden of proof should be on the owner as to what the previous conditions were. We thank you for this detailed comment. The adoption of maps is for informational purposes only and cannot be used for project approval enforcement actions, because wetlands conditions, sizes, and locations change over time. Only actual site conditions govern official actions and will be dictated by current on-site delineations that must be reassessed every 5 years to capture natural changes in site conditions. So this wouldn't be man-made, modified violations or alterations, but only natural site conditions. Additionally, staff has taken the advice of this commenter previously and added language in to specify that the burden of proof is on the property owner under 1970-035C for non-conforming uses.
Mayor Gear.
Mr. Walters.
Again, on the maps, here, is it necessary for us to adopt maps if they're only for informational purposes? If we're just identifying wetlands, is it necessary for us to adopt them? Because I could see how people could be confused about their purpose if they're adopted by ordinance by the city council.
I agree. I know people feel better when we adopt maps, and that there was previously maps that were adopted that are still on the record books and have not been repealed. But again, because critical area conditions actually change often, wetlands can change, streams can change, geologically hazardous areas can change naturally very often. I think it's a burden and beyond our ability to keep up and keep adopting the more accurate maps. So this is a discussion that we should have. Do we want to actually adopt maps, or just refer to them and have them on hand for use and guidance.
Mayor
Yeah,
Gear?
let's revisit. Yeah.
Mayor Gear?
Ms. Moulton?
Thank you. I'd like to weigh in on that. I think that maps are an integral part of this process in this document. For example, the map with the stream names. Obviously, things change, everything changes, but maps are, I think, a vital component of these regulations. And we can acknowledge that they change, but I have so many papers in front of me right now, it's hard to find exactly, but I think the streams, the wetlands, I mean, that gives us a sort of a foundational knowledge with also with the understanding that things do change. So I would advocate strongly for keeping the maps and adopting them.
Mayor Gear?
Mr. Walters?
Yeah, I think that there are a couple of instances where it makes a lot of sense. It's got to come with some adopting language so we know exactly what it is we're talking about when we adopt them. Because it's completely accurate as well that wetlands change over time, and just because it's on a map doesn't mean it's currently there on the ground. And it may be smaller, it may be larger. We just, I think, need to have some either adopting language or disclaimer language on the map as it's displayed on the user's screen or something like that. But I suggest that that's a fairly large discussion that maybe we should revisit.
All right.
Thank you, Mr. Walters. Okay. Additionally, the comment suggests multiple items to include flooding and stormwater integration into the wetlands and critical area sections, as well as considering transfer of development rights to avoid impacts due to reasonable use variances. This would avoid impacts and compensatory mitigation. And these ideas are great. Suggestions that, again, will take a lot of research and background information to prepare and get ready for. What staff really wants to focus everybody's attention on is that GMA requires us to update and revise our critical area ordinance and other ordinances every 8 years. And based on new best available science, based on new state laws, based on our own success or failures, we're required to revisit and revise and update our regulations every 8 years. And because we are so behind right now, this was supposed to be done in 2016. It's due again in 2014. That 8 years doesn't start with adoption. It starts on the date that it was required. So we're only 3 years away from our next required update. So for a lot of these more in-depth discussions and requirements and great ideas, staff recommends that we do some research and get those ready for integration into our next adoption in 2024, but not taking the time to add those now at the 11th hour into this regulation body. But there's some really good information and ideas that come forth in this very last group of comments.
Mayor Gear?
Mr. Walters?
That comment, I think, is also aimed at reducing the reasonable use variances, but we have a process akin to that now requiring a conditional use permit, if I recall correctly. How often does that occur today?
It's not very often, correct.
Has there been any in the last 3 years?
I can say that in the last 2 years, there has not been any. I'm not sure about 3 years.
I couldn't remember precisely how long you've been on staff.
Yes. Mr. Meismer, I see you want to weigh in.
Mayor Gear, if I may. I am not aware of any in the past 10 years.
So I think that is generally an important point. There are a number of processes contained within the proposed ordinance, but also our existing code that would allow you to do things that we might not want you to do to a wetland. But they also aren't exercised very frequently, with some exceptions. So I think we ought to look at the frequency of use as well. I don't, in my view, don't want to make them more available to be used. but in some cases, you've got to have the provision to avoid unconstitutional taking without compensation. So that frequency of use, I think, is a really important mitigating factor.
Yes, that's very good context for considering this. Thank you. Okay. So we received no comments regarding our critical area review procedures. Next are comments based on the wetlands section. And of course, regionally significant wetlands came up again. This commenter is concerned with the loss of protections for Ship Harbor Interpretive Preserve, while the ACFL and March Point herons have appeared to increase protections important to bird habitat. And Ship may have less protections. Regionally significant wetland section was removed from 1970 to 215. And in response to this, it's staff and Washington State Department of Ecology's position that the removal of regionally significant wetlands results in an increase in protections for wetlands such as Ship. The previous code designated them as special in name, but actually reduced the provisions by lowering the buffer designation. Removing this restores protections for these wetlands to the correct rating level and buffer designation. Additionally, Ship and the other named wetlands have been added by name to a second section of critical area regulations under fish and wildlife habitat conservation areas, therefore receiving a second and separate level of special protections for their habitat value over and above wetland function. If, as a commenter suggests, there is new heron rookery in Ship, then the heron nest would receive a third level of protection specific to great blue heron nesting and breeding areas, giving that area overall 3 different bodies of regulation in the critical area ordinance to oversee it. And the great blue nesting breeding is 1970-335 D2C, little c. And there's a lot more comments on Ship, and after we go over all of them, part of my presentation is to have a little bit more discussion on that. So bear with me here. Previous section 1773.40, the commenter is concerned that changes from chapter 17 to the proposed draft changes wetland categories and reduces buffers. New section is 235C, and again, this really is primarily focused on Ship. Wetland categories have not changed. Both systems use the Washington State Wetland Rating System. Wetland buffers ranges are increased in the new code to a maximum buffer of 300 feet, whereas Chapter 17 only had a maximum buffer of 225 feet. This is, in fact, an increase in buffer sizes and protections. Isolated wetlands, the comment brings to our attention an error between draft 2 and draft 3. The intended correction to small isolated wetlands was not captured correctly as discussed by the Planning Commission. And staff thanks you for bringing this to our attention. We will absolutely correct the section 1970-230 B3 little d and B4 to meet the recommendations to what that section was supposed to be corrected to from Planning Commission. Additional comments on wetlands. A comment is concerned with the lack of clarity for the definition between buffers and wetlands and the implications that this can have on property rights, resulting in worthless property and regulatory takings. So this comment is actually on the other side of the line from what almost all of our comments are, and they're concerned with property rights. and protection of property owners as opposed to the regulations or the critical areas. And we thank you for the comment. Staff has ensured allowances to prevent regulatory takings. The criteria for determining wetlands isn't arbitrary, like the commenter is concerned with, but relies on the prescribed method from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and is comprehensive, including the presence of water, but also hydrophytic vegetation and hydric soils, and they must be present long enough during the growing season. When all four of those conditions are present, then the area is considered a wetland. The context of the comment is that for those properties that have a big pond or puddle all winter long, he's concerned that that creates wetland conditions and takes away rights. But it's a little more complicated than that. Category 1 wetlands. Comment expresses concern about the protections for Category 1 wetlands like SHIP and the city's proposed Phase 2 of the Guaymas Channel Trail. Commenter is in support of the recommendations from Kyle Loring and Evergreen Islands. We thank the commenter for their comments. Another comment regarding SHIP. Comment feels that the protections for SHIP have been weakened by being added to the habitats of local importance provisions, and because the rating done by ecology for SHIP drops the classification from a Class 1 to a Class 2 wetland. While Chapter 17 assigned Ship Harbor a classification rating of Class 1 wetland, it also specifically assigned the Class 1 wetland a Class 2 buffer. So there was no functional extra protections at all for SHIP. Ecology strongly defends the position that their rating system synthesizes very technical scientific information into proper wetland rating, and that this assigned rating of a Category 1 arbitrarily in the past wasn't as good of a method for protecting wetlands. Since SHIP previously had a Class 2 buffer and now continues to have a Class 2 rating and buffer, under the new code, there is no diminished protections under wetland-specific regulations, even though it lost the special and arbitrary Class 1 rating. Because staff agrees with the public that SHIP provides exceptional habitat function over and above its basic wetland functions, staff has added SHIP to the removed regionally, and other wetlands that were previously designated regionally significant wetlands. They've been added to habitats of local importance under Fish and Wildlife Habitat Conservation Areas, thereby giving these wetlands a second layer of special protections over and above wetland protections, as discussed previously. It's really important to note that there is no longer a statewide accepted and prescribed critical area type for wetlands of local importance, and therefore there's no specific guidance or protections. On the other hand, habitats of local importance under Fish and Wildlife Habitat Conservation Areas does remain a state recognized critical area with specific provisions and protections and support for best available science from the state agencies. The staff's position that this clearly is an increase in protections for SHIP and other wetlands.
Mayor Gear, I think it's worth pausing here for a second, because this is a pretty important point, and it has come up repeatedly, including more emails that we got today. I think we probably all recognize that Ship Harbor is a really important wetland, and it's a fairly large one too. So I've been studying this issue since we started working on the Critical Areas Ordinance several years ago, and I'm quite certain that the new code protects Ship Harbor just as well as the old code, and obviously arguably better, because wetland buffers are different as a result of the new rating system. Kyle Loring's letter I thought was really good, but it actually, as far as I can tell, doesn't really mention Ship Harbor, except to note that we're deleting the regionally significant wetland text that was in the old code. But that was just linguistic sleight of hand. There is no term of art called regionally significant wetland in Washington state. So it conveyed zero protection. It looked like it did, but it didn't. And then in the same breath, it reduced the buffer from what it pretended to give protection as category 1 down to category 2. I also think it's worth pointing out, as Ms. Cooper hinted at, the code doesn't categorize this wetland as category 2. And Ms. Cooper can correct me if I'm wrong, but the code doesn't categorize the wetland. The wetland is categorized by analysis at the time at which some kind of development or activity is proposed. So it could be category 1 at some point in the future. And I think it's important that those categories, because they're a detailed scientific analysis, depend on that analysis rather than arbitrary designations. But we need to somehow get out that we're not proposing a reduction in protection for Ship Harbor. And I'm certainly open to a detailed argument that analyzes this and shows that it does do that, but I haven't seen that, and it's not in Kyle Loring's letter, and I would expect, because it's very comprehensive, I would expect that he would hit that if it did. So I really want to correct that, because I do not want to reduce the protection for the Ship Harbor wetland.
Thank you, Mr. Walters. And I will walk through that science right now to demonstrate to the public and City Council the fact that it is not, as you determine yourself as well, it does not result in a reduction. So Ship Harbor wetland is definitely a hot topic. So let's kind of go through that. It's, absolutely has wetland values for habitat, stormwater, water quality. It has mostly human values for scenery, recreation, educational purposes. There's a lot of value for it, and we absolutely agree to that. So what is the confusion, and how can I help people understand this more? Hopefully walking through this step by step again. And again, as Mr. Walters suggested, technically for each specific separate project is when you do the rating, and it may change at different times in different locations of the wetland, and it's project specific. But for the purposes of going through the critical area ordinance public process and having people understand what this means better, we had the Department of Ecology just do a rating of Ships Harbor so that we have an idea of what it really means numbers wise, so we can compare and people can understand. So this is Chris Larkin's rating, which is very, very, very lengthy. This is just the cover sheet with the points scoring and this overall information that we need. So based on his scoring, Ship Harbor received 22 total points, which equates to, yes, a category 2 wetland. This makes it less of a category, one less category than the previous code had it, as arbitrarily category 1. It's important to note that the habitat score is 8. What we've eliminated in the code, the previous code said, regionally significant wetlands are designated as a category 1, the following: Cannery Pond, Ships Harbor, and others in the ACFL. Ships Harbor Interpretive Preserve, while it's a category 1, actually is regulated as to buffer widths, which shall be required a category 2. So this language right here says it's important, but then reduces the buffer rating. That language is confusing in and of itself, let alone the fact that regionally significant wetlands are no such thing, as Mr. Walters pointed out. So we've completely eliminated this by the recommendation of the Department of Ecology because it just created confusion.
Mayor Gare.
Mr. McDougall.
Ms. Cooper, thank you for bringing this piece up. And I think I agree with Mr. Walters and the points you're making as well, that that the regionally significant doesn't have legal meaning, and actually Ship Harbor classifying as a tier 2 wetland, it does not get any reduced protection. However, I'm interested in this scoring system because it shows that Ship Harbor is actually just barely a category 2. One more point and it's a category 1 based upon this scoring. And in particular, the improving water quality and hydrologic, where its site potential and landscape potential are both very high, or rated as high. However, the actual value is low. And I'm curious if anyone currently on the call can explain why a wetland with such high potential is actually providing such a low value. Is it because some other development aspect has essentially trapped parts of that wetland from being able to realize its full potential? I don't know if that's a question that could be answered by anyone on the call currently, but it would be good to try to get an answer for that.
Well, I want to clarify what you mean by its hydrology and water quality and site potential. Let me bring this up.
Yeah, if you can clarify, that would be great.
So improving water quality is this column, and it has its own questions. And then hydrology, which is flood storage and so forth, has this. And then habitat. So there's 3 different categories that there's a scoring point in. And if you can see, technically the highest score is 9. And then 7 and 3. So it's high. It's just, just above the median, but it's not technically high, 8 or 9, for site potential, water quality, or hydrologic. It is, though, however, rated higher in habitat function, which is what everybody's talking about.
Mm-hmm. I guess what I was getting at is what's preventing those 7s from being an 8, because you've got a big gap between the potential and then the actual. At least that's how I'm interpreting potential and value. Like, why is the value not a medium, and therefore that would bump it up?
Yep, that's a really good question. So water quality, so looking at where Ship Harbor is, it's at the bottom of a large bowl, large slopes all around it. Stormwater water quality, does this wetland have the potential to capture stormwater, filter it before it enters the system or the aquifers? Absolutely not. It's not capturing it before and filtering it before everything else. It's getting it all last. So it doesn't have the site potential to really provide high water quality and filtration to the area around it, because it's last. It's at the very bottom of the slope.
So if it were upslope a ways, then that value would go up.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you. That's fair.
Yeah, and the same with the hydrologic. How much does this have the ability to capture, redirect, and act like a sponge to prevent flooding in the general basin around it? And again, it doesn't. It's the very last thing that gets the water at the very bottom. This wetland isn't going to hold back floodwaters from the surrounding neighborhoods to prevent them from stormwater and overflows and flooding. So that's where the difference in this one is. That's why it doesn't rate as high, because those 2 categories really, it's not providing those functions to the surrounding basin. Habitat value.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, habitat value, of course, is what everybody's arguing about. And that's what we are absolutely agreeing about, that it does have the highest potential for habitat rating. Yes, good. Hopefully that clarifies for everybody. Very good question. Thank you, Mr. McDougall.
Mayor Gear?
Mr. Walters.
Ms. Cooper, we'll get to this in a second, I'm sure, but especially given that there's very small numbers between category 2 and category 1, I think it is important to note that under the proposed code, the buffers would be the same for high intensity land uses, which would be all residential. And those buffers would be 300 feet for both category 2 and category 1. So if somehow, this was a category 1 wetland that by some other sleight of hand got categorized as category 2, it doesn't help you get to smaller buffers because the buffers are prescribed the same for both category 2 and 1.
Yes, we'll look at that for sure. So to walk us through old code compared to new code, and to see that there is no reduction in protections. So this is how you walk through the system. Using the habitat score of 8, and because our system is so old, we have to use this conversion table. So a score of 8 really is equivalent to a 29 and 36. So we come over to our buffer table and find 29, 36. Again, Ship Harbor is rated as a category 1, but our code says category 2. So 29 to 36 point value in a category 2 wetland equals a 225 foot buffer. So current code, chapter 17, even with the regionally significant wetlands, equals a 225 foot buffer. That's it. That's the max possible. And as Mr. Walters noted, in the previous code, as well as our new code, both category 2 and category 1 buffers are the same, 225, 110, 75. 225, 110, 75. So there's technically no special bigger protections for category 1 than there is 2. Where the more protections is coming in is our proposed code, where we actually look at the land use intensity based on what the development impact is going to be on the wetland. That's what bumps up your protection and gives you a bigger buffer now. So again, working through the science, currently Ships Harbor is a 225 foot buffer. And again, no difference. Even if we drop it from category 1 to category 2, same protection. Now, the new code, we use the same habitat score of 8, takes us to this table for points 8 or 9 points for habitat. We use this table. Okay, using ecology's rating of category 2, which again, it was right on the borderline. Somebody else's rating could be a little bit different. It is a little bit more subjective and based on each individual project. Still, for high land use intensity, which in our table is based on our zoning, commercial for the mixed marine use area, like the dock, the ferry dock, and mostly residential, for these uses, high land use intensity is going to be a 300 foot buffer. Now for Ships Harbor specifically, if we're going to talk about a paved trail, for instance, the Quemis Channel Trail, that falls into the moderate land use intensity category and equals a 225 foot buffer. So therefore, previously 225 foot buffer, now proposed is 300 or a 225 foot buffer. It's equal or greater protections. Now, what is this last column? Low land use intensity. Yes, it identifies 150 foot buffer possibly. But so we know that's not for the commercial or residential development that could be happening in the area, or even the Quemis Channel Trail. So what low land use intensity refers to only is unpaved trails. So let's just say, for argument's sake, which sometimes isn't the case, this existing interpretive trail, it's argumented whether compact gravel actually is paved or unpaved. But let's say it's unpaved for argument's sake. And we want to do something similar to this in the vicinity of Ships Harbor Wetland, because we find it recreationally, educationally, and culturally important to our regionally significant wetland. An unpaved trail would be low land use intensity for the Category 2 wetland and equal to 150-foot buffer. Well, what does that mean? I mean, where and what is a 150-foot buffer? If you want to use this as an example, this unpaved trail, there's no way that we know that it goes bridges over, around, within, has lookout points right at the edge of. There's no way that this is anywhere as close to this new required 150-foot buffer. If you want to look at it back on this view, look at this trail and raised boardwalk, viewing platform right at the edge. This is a large structure. None of this will even be anywhere as close to allowed in the new Ships Harbor wetland regulations. So that really gives us context of what we're talking about. And hopefully that helps clarify that there's no way, shape, or form the protections are being reduced for Ships Harbor. In fact, as discussed earlier, not only are the wetland protections under the wetland regulations, but it is now going to be a habitat of local importance, because yes, we agree, this habitat value is very high. So now it's going to be habitat of local importance with its own special regulations over and above. So hopefully that really helps people digest what this actually means.
Yeah, Gary? Yes, I can't hear you, but I'm assuming that I could go ahead. Thank you. You know, Ms. Cooper, I just really wanted to comment on the personal benefit to me of that example that you just gave, because in showing what we have now and what the new buffer is and how that will work, I found that very helpful in the not only the illustration and showing the picture of, but showing what it could be and what's not allowed. So thank you very much for that.
Yes, I hope that helps everybody else as well.
Mayor Gear.
Mr. Walters.
One component of that structure that you just took us through was the land use intensity, which is in that chart right there on screen. As I recall, when we went through this previously, I thought that we had prescribed some changes to the text definitions of the land use intensity categories, because as it reads in the draft, it mentions zoning, and I thought that we were going to remove the zones, and I thought that ecology had recommended that as well, or someone had last time around, because the zones themselves don't fit into ecology's definition of the land use intensities. As I recall, it's residential, urban residential land use is high intensity, regardless of the zoning. Do you agree?
Absolutely, and that was a discussion, and so I'll make a note to, you're right, that change is one that still needs to be integrated. Yes, it's okay, all development. It doesn't need to be divided out by the different zones, correct? And that's really just cleaning up and reducing wording. It doesn't change anything functionally. Okay. Moving on. Okay, so I just noted that these belong down below, so I'll now moving on to talk about fish and wildlife conservation areas. We have multiple comments on the March Point Heronry, appreciating the work and improvements to the March Point Heronry. One small suggestion is to clarify the language to read from the outer boundary of the nesting colony. So we've noted that. That's a good suggestion. Staff recommends it. Also, the link that was previously in the text under WDFW Great Blue Heron is no longer correct. The commenter provided us with the correct link. So we agree, thank you for this pointing this out. We'll be sure to fix that link as well. And an additional comment commends us for our work to improve the protections for the herons at March Point Heronry. So staff wants to thank folks for taking the time to let us know those positive comments as well. So we have some more discussion in depth from comments about streams. One commenter is concerned with the removal of the stream names and believes that 50-foot buffers are inadequate. Staff's response was that stream names didn't have any scientific value for the function of the regulations. The streams remain the same, the regulated streams remain the same, and their names remain on the map, just not in the text of the regulations. Streams are now classified by their regulated state designation of water typing, which has more scientific value. Stream buffers have not changed between Chapter 17 and the update. They are both 50 feet, which is supported by our best available science report. The confusing and contradictory separation or separate section for riparian areas and buffers has been removed from the text, but the riparian area, which is where the larger buffers were integrated into the previous text. However, riparian areas, as well as biodiversity areas and wildlife corridors, remain as protected state-listed priority habitats under Fish and Wildlife Habitat Conservation Areas. And again, I'll show you, we'll talk about a little bit more about this, and I'll show you some examples to help understand.
Mayor Gear? Thank you. So, Ms. Cooper, thank you. I still have some confusion about the stream buffers. I have a copy of the geoengineers stream buffer best available science review. So I've been trying to wade through this, and it looks like in my reading that some of the riparian buffers are wider in the existing Chapter 17. So I just want to mark this for further discussion. Because I also see that in that same report, they recommend basically that the 50-foot buffer is the minimum, as far as I can tell, as long as the quality of the buffer is high. So I believe this section requires more discussion and a deeper dive, because I'm not, as I understand it, it doesn't seem to be enough to me. So I look forward to discussing this further.
Yep, I'll go into quite a bit more detail tonight, as well as we can certainly discuss it. I'll make sure to do examples next week as well. So this is a little bit more clear for everybody.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm. So the buffers, riparian buffers as regulated under Fish and Wildlife Habitat Conservation Areas, are proposed to be variable dependent on the specific needs based on science and individual habitat assessment reports, and not arbitrarily created buffers. Again, there was a table with just arbitrary buffers in Chapter 17. But the way we plan on doing it now is that each section with riparian habitat has to do their own assessment and using best available science prescribe their own buffer. So again, I'll get to that and we'll see a little bit more about that. The majority of the stream lengths in the city limits actually don't have any adjacent riparian area, and larger buffers would result in unfair and overprotective regulations for certain stream reaches in our urban area. So there's more comments, and again, more of my presentation to talk about that. So the next comment I want to talk about was one of our verbal comments during last session's hearing that expressed concerns that wildlife corridors are not included or protected in draft 3, but are very important habitat that should be protected. And I want to point out that draft reference 1970-315 A8 section does actually regulate. So we agree. Habitat corridors are very important, especially in UGA and urban areas. And we apologize that the word corridor was actually omitted from the draft. Thank you for bringing this to attention. We will certainly correct it, and you'll see that visually soon. As the draft currently reads, though, it states little a biodiversity areas, semicolon. It should read biodiversity areas and corridors. Wildlife corridors are still functionally protected even if that word is missing in this critical area ordinance, because it is a specified terrestrial habitat that is protected as a state priority habitat under Fish and Wildlife Conservation Areas in section 1970-315-8A. This description of biodiversity areas and corridors as protected in draft 3 under that section can be found on page 255 of the state priority habitats and species list found. And for those of you who want to go there, the link is located here, and we'll actually go and look at that here in a minute. Commenter expressed concerns that the ACFL doesn't have stronger buffer requirements, that the forest itself should have buffers or stronger, wider buffers. And we want to thank you for that comment. We've made note of it. And then one last comment on streams. The commenter is concerned with the provisions that allow stream location and reduce setbacks from roadside ditches. We want to thank you for your comments. We also want the public to keep in mind that many of the streams within the urban environment are modified and artificially constructed channels or even piped segments. Relocation includes moving these into a more natural channel location and configuration further away from urban impacts and essentially functioning as stream restoration projects. Relocation just to move it out of a project's way is not likely to meet the other requirements necessary to be approved. And this comment cites a certain project that has been presented to the city. And staff really wants to articulate the fact that those type of projects and proposals to just relocate streams, they don't meet the requirements in that particular project. Staff analyzed it, and it does not meet the requirements under the critical area ordinance. That project has been requested to be revised to eliminate the stream relocation portion of it. That these are strict standards, and it has to be a net ecological gain and function as a more restoration. We're not just allowing streams to be relocated under this section. And again, I'll show a few examples of that.
Mayor Gear. Thank you. Ms. Cooper, thank you for this clarification. I also have questions about this section that I believe you will answer. And I think that the language in the draft needs to be edited to reflect this. And this is another area I would like to explore more fully. So it sounds like you're going to, so thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Ms. Moulton. Okay, before I jump into that, I just want to finish this one last comment under Fish and Wildlife Habitat Conservation Areas. March Point and the ACFL, the commenter notes the improvements to the section and supports the changes. And we just want to thank you for your positive comment as well. So, stream location. So, as noted, yes, we could potentially strengthen the language to clarify. but staff doesn't really feel it's necessary because there's so many other provisions that require mitigation sequencing and variance criteria and no net loss provisions and ecological evaluation reports, that all of the steps under that the section for critical area procedures that we had no comments or suggestions for revision on, that's the section of the report that sets up the requirements to either be approved or denied. It makes it very clear as to what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And these are two projects not actually located in the city of Anacortes or relevant to Anacortes, but I thought for good illustration purposes, I wanted to bring to your attention really what the function of relocation is. And these are two projects that I've been involved with. Personally, this one's in Oak Harbor, just outside city limits. And likewise, in the city of Anacortes, we have all of these man-made artificial, you can see these are agricultural ditches, man-made channels, natural conditions are no longer present on the site. Agricultural ditch comes onto this property, is diverted around the property. This is the more natural location, and this is a very artificial agricultural ditch that just goes around it. The property owners want to build a single family home and a garage. They need to build the road and utilities in to their property. There's already an existing culvert here, so the project analysis, biological evaluation, and permitting through the county and state Fish and Wildlife proposed to just dig a ditch to allow utilities to cross here, and that was it. Everything else was going to be existing. Fish and Wildlife biologists met on the site, walked the property, and said, why would you do that? Let's completely fill in this portion of the stream and relocate it to the more natural portion, eliminating this section altogether. Because this is artificial, obviously there's no natural replication of channel, there's no complexity and channel morphology. There's no ecological benefits right here. Let's just completely fill this in, build your road and utilities to your property, and relocate and restore the stream flow and function to just this main section where it's one, closer to riparian habitat, more shade, more function. It's a more complex channel shape, replicating more natural conditions. And it gets everything further away from the development and the human activity and the potential impacts and contamination. So that was the direction from the state Fish and Wildlife biologist for relocation. Another example of city of Mount Vernon, this warehouse located here proposed to do a warehouse expansion. We have two very man-modified stream channels, Maddox Creek and Flowers Creek. You can see the majority of it is modified into agricultural ditches. There's very little natural shape or channel morphology. There's very little riparian in here, riparian habitat in here. And so likewise, the state Fish and Wildlife biologist for this project through the permitting was very supportive of relocating the stream here. So we, you can see all of the riparian habitat is in this vicinity. There's wetlands in this vicinity. And potentially even this was the original stream channel location. It's hard to say. But you can see how we have the ability to make a more natural shaped stream with improved channel morphology. You want to have meanders and pools and riffles and different locations and more stream habitat. So you can see, again, the benefits, you get it away from the intense use, closer to riparian, and further away from potential contamination and impact. So when we say stream restoration, stream relocation, this is really what we mean. It can absolutely be beneficial. So when we look at the city of Anacortes and most of our streams, yeah, we have some natural, and we have a lot of natural sections, but we also have a lot of man-made, artificial, ditched, piped segments. So is it not potentially beneficial to leave that in here to allow those type of projects? So if we feel that the wording needs to be very specific and changed so that there aren't negative relocations, we can certainly do that. But staff feels confident in the way that it's put together now that that's not the case.
Mayor Gear.
Ms. Moulton.
Thanks. Again, I'd like to discuss this further because I do think that at some point, because I think the language needs to be changed, because that's not the way that I have read it. So I think that can be clarified, but thank you. I appreciate what you're saying, Ms. Cooper.
Second.
Okay, noted. We will certainly look at how we can improve that. So next is the Fish and Wildlife Habitat Conservation Areas. I just want to point out the section that designates what different habitats are protected and regulated. And as I stated, 8A specifically lists state priority habitats and associated areas as defined in the State Department of Fish and Wildlife Priority Habitat and Species List. And this says it's updated 2019, and I need to change that because it was just updated this year in 2021. But this section specifically states includes, but may not be limited to the following. So we had a generalized list of the majority of habitats and species that are in this list, but because it's very comprehensive, we didn't list them all. We just picked the most important ones, or the ones that were potentially most relevant to our location. And you can see this is where I say that the comment about wildlife corridors, this is where the word was omitted and we propose to fix it. So corridors, biodiversity areas and corridors will be protected habitats, as well as the stream versus riparian area discussion. Riparian areas themselves are also protected areas. This is where we propose that there's a difference between streams, stream buffers, riparian areas, and riparian buffers. So if we go to the priority habitat and species list, as you can see, updated 2021, there is multiple species and animals that are protected. They aren't listed individually, but because they're priority habitats and species, they're protected. Snails, slugs, clams, beetles, dragonflies, worms. There's so many different species, as well as habitats, terrestrial, aquatic, and priority. So terrestrial, aquatic, or terrestrial habitats, we have biodiversity areas and corridors. And this specifies what exactly that is and how to protect it. And you can see for corridors are areas of relatively undisturbed and unbroken tracts of vegetation that connect fish and wildlife habitat conservation areas, priority habitats, areas identified as biologically diverse and valuable habitats within a city or a UGA. Online information for the guidelines of managing these areas is located here in this document by Fish and Wildlife. And I just want to point out to everybody that, again, the body of regulations did protect these. We made sure that that wording error is corrected. And we also do have a map that identifies potential wildlife corridors to help us identify and regulate those as well within the city of Anacortes. So I know that's also been a hot topic of concern, wildlife corridors, and I just want to reassure everybody that we agree it's important and that they are valuable and they are protected, and these are the requirements that get there.
Mayor Gear?
Yes, Ms. Moulton.
Thank you, Ms. Cooper. This is really helpful. And is this document included via a link in the actual draft?
It is.
Great, thank you.
It is in the draft. It is also in the comment matrix.
Great, so I mean, when this is finally adopted, if someone's reading it online, they can click on this part of the document and be taken to this website where everything's listed.
Absolutely.
Great, thanks.
Let's see here.
We may want, Mayor Gear,
Yes, Mr. Walters.
we may want to consider adding a line at the beginning of the ordinance, allowing the code revisor to update the links as they become broken over time.
Perfect. This is the map link. And I think above is the document link, but we'll certainly make sure to take some time to make sure that's the case.
Thank you.
And so the one other thing, so that's habitat corridors. I want to reassure everybody. Next is, let's just go here to riparian areas. The description, riparian areas are adjacent to flowing or standing freshwater aquatic systems. Riparian habitats encompass the area beginning at the ordinary high water mark and extending to the portion of the terrestrial landscape that is influenced by or that directly influences the aquatic ecosystem. Riparian systems, vegetation, water table, soils, microclimates, wildlife and habitats, and so forth are influenced by perennial and intermittent waters, and so forth. And later on, we'll come back to this because this is more of a conversation that we'll get to for comments that go in more in depth about riparian areas and buffers. But I want to point out the online mapping tool here. That the section of riparian area and the Fish and Wildlife recommendations for regulating it directly bring us to here, which is the map for site potential tree height and riparian management zones, which we'll talk about. That's a comment and a concern brought up coming up here. Okay. So there were also no public comments on geologically hazardous areas, critical aquifer recharged areas, frequently flooded areas, or definitions. Next, we have Evergreen Island suggestions, and I want to take a minute to thank Mr. Loring. They actually put together a well-thought, well-organized, cited document that really provided some really good constructive feedback, recommendations, and so forth. And staff was really thankful for the time and thoughtfulness that they put into it because it really is helpful in us being able to respond and articulate and integrate some of the recommendations. So they put together a very thorough one, and I'm going to try to go through this. Most of them are actually pretty simple. A lot of additional wordsmithing and clarifications and making things more grammatically correct. So they're really simple, really easy. Some of them will go into more depth with riparian areas, buffers, and so forth. So here's a wordsmithing one. Access to potential impacts to the critical areas and determine if they can be avoided or minimized. They recommended additional clarifications, access or assess the potential impacts to the critical area and determine if they can be avoided or minimized. And clarifying statement, Evergreen Island recommends, in reviewing the impacts in the applicant's critical area report, the city may engage an independent qualified expert at the applicant's expense. We already have that written in, the ability to get third-party review at the applicant's expense, but clarifying it here is helpful. So staff recommends considering this potential change.
Here.
Mr. Walters.
Also, what if it's not the applicant? What if it is a code enforcement action?
It would be applicant or the homeowner, or yeah, that's a good. Well, I have to look back and see what this section is specifically, if it's the process reviewing or so forth. But that's a good point.
Yeah, I don't know if it needs to go here, and maybe it doesn't need to go in 1970 at all. Maybe it should be in our enforcement code. But it does seem to me that if somebody damages a critical area and there's no report on file indicating that it's category 1, 2, 3, or 4 wetland or whatever type of critical area, that we might need to engage an expert and we might need to bill somebody for that. I think we want to be pretty careful in that area, and maybe it does belong in the enforcement code, but this has come up and I know it's a current controversy and we should try to deal with it right now, I think.
Yeah, I'll certainly take some time to look at that, and I agree. Okay. Restoration or replacement of a structure that is damaged by fire, natural disaster, or other calamity. Evergreen Islands is suggesting that if that's the case, that the homeowner will only be allowed to replace up to 75% of its square footage. Staff hesitates to recommend this and refers this suggestion to legal for further review. This is to whether this would be a regulatory taking or have other legal implications.
Mayor Gear?
Mr. Miller.
Yeah, without the legal review, I am opposed to this language as well. I mean, you're already, you know, there's already another calamity. Now you're adding to that. So I would oppose this language in whatever the legal review is.
Second.
That's staff's position as well. We will certainly consult Ms. Swetnam on that then and bring that back. Again, Evergreen Islands recommends striking the word biking from passive outdoor activities. I think City Council has discussed this at length, understanding what the provision in this exemption table actually means and implies, and that whether biking or no biking is listed has no functional change. City Council actually requested that the word biking get put back in, and so we did that in draft 3. It is possible, though, that we could certainly look at the wording of this provision all together and completely scratch it and really clarify, or even just remove passive outdoor activities from the exemption table altogether, as it is not development, and maybe having it listed in a development regulations is what's coming up, is creating all of the controversy. So staff recommends further review of passive outdoor activities altogether.
Mayor Gear?
Ms. Wilson.
Thank you. I'd like to include the Parks Department in that conversation as well when we have it.
Mayor Gear?
Mr. Walters.
Yeah, I think we ought to back up and not use the words provided. Because that's sort of legalese, versus something like except when or only if, something a little more plain language to introduce the section might help us out as well.
As previously discussed, we had to add the word non-motorized for trails back in to describe that maintenance, operation, and repair of these is allowed because these motorized trails are allowed in the deeds and conservation easements that we have on these lands. So we can't preclude ourselves from managing those. We had multiple discussions on that. City Council agreed that it was necessary that that word get put back in. But Evergreen Islands is requesting that we take it back out. Staff does not recommend that, but again, we're open to discussion if somebody feels strongly about this or or wants to talk further about it.
Mayor Gear.
Mr. McDougall.
The way I was reading the document from Evergreen Islands, the draft 3 has non-motorized struck out and Evergreen Islands has non-motorized put back in. Am I reading that incorrectly?
Nope, that's correct. We took the word non-motorized out because we just want to be able to maintain, operate or repair trails in general.
Trails. Okay,
we don't want to limit ourselves to only repairing non-motorized trails, meaning that the motorized trails will have to go into disrepair and not be able to be used in the future.
Thank you. Yeah.
We have deed restrictions that require us to offer those in particular lands. So it's our responsibility to maintain and update those as needed. So that's why it seems like it's reversed, but so removing the word non-motorized allows us to maintain those trails.
Thank you for unreversing it for me.
Mayor Gear.
Mr. Walters.
I actually think one of the best reasons for leaving that word out is you can't tell necessarily from looking at a trail if it's a motorized or a non-motorized trail. Not until somebody comes down the trail can you tell. And I think Ms. Cooper has alluded a couple of times to the fact that we can regulate these in a couple different ways. And we've been working on that alternative method, which is a chapter regulating the ACFL separately. I think that that's probably going to get us more directly where it is we want to go.
Thank you for that. Okay, so in working with the Parks Department, touring the Anacortes community forest lands, talking about future needs, trail maintenance, and so forth, it became very obvious to staff that trails often become damaged, washed out, in disrepair because of the critical areas themselves, high water levels, storm events, and so forth. And that repairing and maintaining these trails is important to maintain our facilities and keep them open to the public. But that sometimes the trail locations are maybe too close or in an inappropriate location, and that will require continued maintenance over and over and over again in the future for repairing these. So staff included a new provision into draft 3 that specified where trail relocation is the preferred method of repair. Trail relocation further away from a critical area is not to be considered a new trail, but is included in the exemption for operation, maintenance, and repair or replacement to make it easier and more economically feasible in the future and better impacts on the critical area itself to just outright move the trail away from that area that continuously is causing problems.
Mayor
We
Gear.
felt it was necessary. Evergreen Islands is requesting we take that back out.
Mr. Walters.
I think that we can find a third way here. Number one, I think the text proposed by staff doesn't fit in the list of A, B, C. So I think it shouldn't be included in that list. I think it should be a separate sentence under this recreation areas operation, maintenance, repair, replacement. And I think what we should say is that trail relocation, when it's the preferred method of repair, is allowed with this letter of exemption process, but put some additional bookends on it in this, in that it not be wider, it not be a different surface, it not be, you know, the other things that could make it a worse of an impact. I do feel good about the fact that there is a letter of exemption process that you've got to obtain from the planning department before you can go do it. So you, assumedly that's analogous to the shoreline context where you've got to get a letter of exemption. And so if we just make that D not part of the list and put bookends in that new sentence, I think that we can fix that.
Very good. That's a good direction. Thank you. We will certainly work on that. Okay. In the applicability section, an applicant may seek an alteration of a critical area or critical area buffer through a permitted alteration when application of the standards renders compliance with these provisions infeasible and the proposed development meets the specific terms of this section and can be considered a reasonable use. So that's lengthy, wordy, and a lot of legalese. Evergreen Islands just wordsmithed it to make it shorter and more clear. An applicant may seek an alteration of a critical area or critical area buffer through a permitted alteration when application of the standards in this chapter would result in the denial of a reasonable and economically viable use of the property, and the proposed development meets the specific terms of this section. So staff recommends considering these changes. It certainly cleans it up and makes it more clear.
Mayor Gear,
Ms. Middleton.
I agree with that assessment, Ms. Cooper. I think the language is an improvement on that.
Any other discussion?
Second.
Yeah, second.
Thank you.
Second.
Third. I think that's a fourth.
Yeah. Very good. Okay, another wordsmithing, public services. We've talked about this at length. We've changed it from, you know, public roads, water supply, sewer, stormwater management, electric, telephone, for transportation of persons and freight. Concerned about paved trails being movement of persons is one of Evergreen Island's concerns from the beginning. So a simple wordsmith change, adding the term and transportation by city road for persons and freight helps clarify and eliminate that ambiguity. And so staff recommends considering this suggestion change as well.
Mayor Gear?
Ms. Moulton.
I question this change. I'm not sure. My reading of it is that a city road is a preferable installation environmentally to an unpaved trail. So I don't know if I'm reading it correctly, but to me, this is saying that a city road has fewer environmental impacts than a non-motorized trail, for example. So that needs to be clarified to me because as I read it, I don't get it.
Yeah, that's absolutely a good concern. I mean, Evergreen's Island's position is right that they want to prevent non-motorized trails, but as a city council, what are your values? Do you feel that the non-motorized trails for transportation purposes is valuable, is a less impact, and should be included into public roads, facilities, and public services. So
yes, I do. I will answer yes to that question.
okay, any other discussion or?
Mayor Gear,
Walters.
I think we need to go back to what the context is. What is the citation? 045F is a list of permitted activities, and public services is struck. And now it reads public roads and utilities in draft 3. But then it has a definition of public services, but public services has already been struck. Oh, I guess it's used again. Anyway, it's sort of a complicated area here.
Well, it's meant to be clear that it just means public roads and utilities in this section for allowances and under those specific requirements. And technically, Ms. Moulton, to your consideration, recreational facilities and trails is also in the same category. That activity would just be categorized in that provision for those specifications, but is still in the same level of allowances of permitted alteration. So they're really just specifying what public roads and utilities means, but it doesn't functionally prohibit trails. Trails would be under the recreational facilities.
It does appear that it's an attempt to prohibit trails, though. It reads that way. So in that spirit, I disagree with it.
Okay.
Mayor.
Mr. Walters.
I don't think it is because as Ms. Cooper points out, trails are down below. I think it's just a method of categorization. And I don't yet quite understand the import, the consequence of categorizing them one way or another. So it might require, I think, some additional study. I don't think it's quite as simple as just prohibiting them or not. Because up above, public services, electric power, telephone, cable, telephone, gas, those utilities do strike me as different from trails. On the other hand, I certainly see the argument that non-motorized transportation is via trail could also be the case. But I don't think we want to confuse recreational trails. I don't know. I think it's worthy of really reading through this section and seeing how it works before making a choice.
Okay, well, let's look at it a little bit more deeply because it's also, non-motorized trails as transportation. So I think that there's something that needs to be looked at here, and I'm sure we can come to some agreement.
Anything else? Okay.
Because we created a table that specifically listed all the different critical areas and whether activities were allowed in the buffer or in the critical area, it was clear that under recreational areas, we had to separate the ACFL out and put it as its own category in the table so that we could differentiate buffers from the actual critical area and what's allowed. So we added that to the table. For some reason, Evergreen Islands recommends striking that entirely from the table so that there are no provisions for the ACFL. Staff's positions, it's important to have this distinction for the administrative of the code. We need to specifically have what we do and don't do in the ACFL and not the ACFL because it is a regulated critical area in our code still. We're not removing it. There's going to be other AMC code that talks about the management of, but it being listed as a critical area is still technically in our code, so we need to have it in the table to know how to apply it to certain projects. So staff does not recommend adopting this recommendation.
Here.
Mr. Walters.
I struggle with this one, I guess maybe because it's conceptually difficult, but ordinarily you wouldn't consider a city park to be a critical area. You would consider the stream within the park, the wetland within the park, the geohazard within the park to be the critical area. You'd buffer off of that. If you call the entire park a critical area, how do you make determinations as to where you should put the trail that is allowed under the code within the critical area or within the critical area's buffer? How do you make those determinations? Doesn't it make it harder to protect the actual critical area if everything is a critical area?
Yeah, I agree with following that thought process. And again, that really is a more detailed discussion of whether we want to remove the ACFL altogether from critical areas. So this would functionally, yes, remove from the table, but we really would have to remove it from critical areas altogether. And if City Council agrees and has support for that, we can certainly discuss it. I think right now it functionally works. It's not the best application. It does make it very difficult and less protective. I agree with your reasoning, Ryan. I think maybe once the public sees the new administrative code that is going to regulate it more and the management of and uses of trails and so forth, once we adopt that section, apply that section and see how it works, they may feel more comfortable with removing it as a critical area. So in my opinion, this might be better revisited in 3 years when we go to do the newest update. We do all of the other groundwork to really clarify and build up the ACFL, and that will make it easier to understand that it's okay to remove it from a critical area code.
Yeah, I think that removing it as a critical area doesn't remove the protections of the critical areas ordinance. Because if you call the entire ACFL a critical area, then it raises the question, how do you protect the entirety of the ACFL when you are allowing activities that ordinarily you would want to exclude from the critical area itself? So you want to exclude the activity from the critical area. They might be allowed in the buffer, but if the whole thing is the critical area, then I'm not sure how you determine how you minimize the impact on the critical area. But I take your point, and I'm okay with deferring this question to 3 years from now. But I think it needs some further analysis, and yeah, if we regulate it through a special critical areas chapter in the code, I think maybe we'll be better positioned to do that. So maybe it's okay to defer this question, but it still is conceptually difficult, and I'd really like to see how it works on the ground. So if there's a trail proposed through what is called a critical area in its entirety, how does that end up being regulated differently under the text that's proposed today versus a different regulatory regime where the lake or the wetland itself is protected, and then we regulate the trail activity or whatever it is in the buffer to minimize the impact on the lake. If there's no change in protection, then it's not worth messing with. But if there is a change in protection, then I would think it would be a positive change. Then it would be worth changing this. So I'm okay with deferring this question to later.
I can also make that a scenario in next week's example. If you really want to see, we can say we're proposing a new trail in the ACFL and work through the code so you can see how it works. If you think that would be valuable at this stage.
Mayor Gear,
Yeah.
I just wanted to voice the support for that test. If you could do that, that would be very helpful.
Ryan,
I was just gonna say, if no one else is interested, I would still be interested, and we could do it offline, but maybe others are as well. Sounds like Mr. Young is.
I will include that as a case study and we'll walk through it to see how it will work for trails in the ACFL, to see what the outcome of the protections are. Absolutely.
So Tess, it's 8:50 and I was thinking at 9 o'clock, we'll decide, make a plan for next week.
Okay.
Okay.
So that will take me, well, yeah, there's still quite a bit here and a little bit of a discussion. So we'll work down through this for the next 10 minutes. Unless at 9 o'clock you want it, I can either stop here and you can see if there's public that wants to actually make comments tonight still. And then at 9 o'clock we can call it. That'll give us a little bit of time until 9 o'clock. Or I can work through this until 9 o'clock and then we can just come back next week. I can finish this and we can include the public comment at that time.
I don't see any hands up. So why don't we you continue and we'll do a public comment next week.
Mayor Gear.
Excuse me, never mind. I've got two
Yeah.
hands up. So help me. All right, so Kyle, can you hear me?
I can. Can you hear me, Mayor Gear?
I can. You're welcome and go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I wasn't quite ready, but you can imagine after hearing comments that I wrote or worked on anyway, characterized in many different ways, that I'd want to provide a brief comment at least tonight. And so I just want to touch on a few issues that you've been discussing. The first one is that Anacortes community forest lands. Yeah, I think it's a really important point. And I know that it sounds like there was some surprise when Evergreen Islands proposed to eliminate some language that was in this proposed code. And the reason for that, though, is that if you look through that table, say for the Anacortes community forest lands, that allows permitted alterations, and it allows them in critical areas and the buffers. And if you worked your way down through our comment letter, you would see that the concern was that there's no way from that table to know whether you're talking about the entire place, the Anacortes community forest lands, or the wetlands or streams within that area, or the other habitats. So that table allows really largely unchecked development of those areas, if you're to read through that. I say unchecked, of course, there are the things like no net loss provisions that we all know are really a myth, but I know are important things to include in a critical areas ordinance, even if they're not capable truly of achieving no net loss. So that's the concern there. There were a lot of other points. Let's see, like relocating streams. I heard at least there was some concern there, and there really should be. The presentation focused on that being restoration projects, and that's a totally different issue. So having some language about allowing for restoration projects would be fantastic in here. And I think that could be crafted without too much trouble. But to have these very broad terms that allow for relocation of existing streams, including salmon-bearing streams, is certainly not an approach that I think would be upheld, frankly, if there were a challenge on it. And two, is not a smart way to go about protecting streams there. So I think some simple revisions could probably address that one, especially where you're talking about man-made ditches. That's what we heard a lot about. Maybe even some woman-made ditches. Who knows exactly? There was some conversation about names, and the issue there really is just that names matter to people. And so the names have been included in the critical areas ordinance to date, and they're being removed. And that causes a lot of bother, whether it has a very strict regulatory impact or not. That's something that worries folks, because they start to see the loss of the name, and then they wonder what else is going to be lost about that really important place after that. So that's why we recommended inserting some names. It certainly wouldn't hurt, and names frequently remain the same over time that way. And then there were a couple of others, but I did just want to touch on one last one here, and that was that the rebuild. And the Evergreen Islands proposal was not that somebody would be allowed to rebuild just 75% of their structure. It was that somebody would be able to rebuild the entire structure, but that you would come into compliance with current rules if it was destroyed more than 75%. Basically, if something, an unfortunate incident happened to your house and it was destroyed all the way, you take the opportunity to rebuild in a place that was consistent with current rules and understandings of the impacts of that place there, as long as it was possible to do so. If it weren't, then there would be a reasonable use exception or something else, of course, to rebuild in a different spot. And I see that my timer should have run out. For some reason, it stopped at 54 seconds. I will stop, and I thank you very much for your time. And I really do encourage questions, because there was quite a bit of mischaracterization about both what we wrote and what we intended. So I do encourage people to reach out. Thank you very much.
We can't hear you.
All right, so I see that Tom Glade has his hand up, so I'm going to allow Tom to speak.
Good evening, Mayor and City Council. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I have a couple of comments. One's about Ship Harbor being classified as a reasonably significant wetland, and it would be perfectly okay with me if you change that language to say it's a habitat of local importance. And even better, since there's a heronry there now, and also a state priority habitat. So I think we should consider that too as part of the edit. And then the other one is, well, one thing is about the passive recreation. So the outdoor recreation, state comprehensive outdoor recreation plan discusses active and passive recreation. Active recreation refers to predominantly muscle-powered activities such as jogging, cycling, field and court sports. They commonly depend on developed sites. Passive recreation refers to activities that require very little use of muscle power, and such as nature viewing, photography, or picnicking. So then in the final thing about the Anacortes community forest, I was under the impression that Mr. Walters and Bob Berry were going to write a new section about the critical areas requirements for the ACFL. So I'm not sure what that, what's the status of that. And it'd be interesting to know which way that's going to go. And especially, and there was one thing is that you discussed about was putting it off till some of these changes to the critical areas ordinance until 2014, but that's 3 years away. And as Mr. Meismer discussed earlier in this evening, that Anacortes is booming and development is booming. So, you know, a lot of harm to environmental areas can, you know, happen in that time. So I urge you to, you know, complete a really good critical areas ordinance as soon as possible. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Tom. All right, so Mr. Wetcher. Brian, can you hear me? Brian?
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, Brian.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor Gear, council members. I would like to refer back to the earlier part of the discussion concerning maps and the related topic of inventories. And I understand that we have environmental changes that do change the outlines and delineations over the years. But having been involved since the late 1980s and into the early 90s in doing some of the inventories on the ground in the city of Anacortes and the surrounding areas of the island at that time, I've seen the inventories drop physically. We've lost a lot of spots, and a map is just an indication of the inventories. So I would really urge City Council and staff to support the idea that we need an inventory of what we have out there. Yes, it may change over the years, but most of the changes that I've seen over the last few years have been development driven. And mostly for habitat loss. No net loss means we have to have a baseline to begin with, or we do not know what we've lost. Like the old saying from Joni Mitchell's song, you don't know what you've you don't know what you've got till it's gone. And there's a lot that's been gone. So please, we need an inventory of what we have to know what we need to protect to begin with. So please incorporate that into this document, that we need to continually inventory, and that we need to inventory what we have now before we go forward. Maps are great. Maps can change. Administrations can change. And I see, and I'd just like to leave it at that. I'd like to make further comment at the next meeting on several other items, but I see that my time is stuck at 1:33, but I thank you very much for letting me address you tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Wetcher. Appreciate your comments tonight. And stop sharing, right? Okay. All right, Council, back to you and Tess. Any comments at this point? Or Tess, if you want to bring this to a close, and we'll leave the public hearing open till next week, and next steps from you and the council.
Perfect. Thank you, Mayor Gear. Council's been discussing as we've gone along. We still have a few more to go over. Let's see, we've taken additional public testimony. So if we go back to tonight, we are reviewing the comments and discussion. So we took additional testimony. We certainly have more work to do, so we won't close the hearing. We'll leave it open. So next week we'll come back on the 10th, if everybody's okay with coming back that soon. We'll carry over and review the finish the public comments that we didn't go through. Again, there's some really good information that Evergreen Islands provided us with, and we really value the feedback. So we do want to finish having time to really discuss that in depth. And then, as stated, we'll go through some case studies to really see how this works, so everybody has a feeling for it. And then continue the public hearing, and we'll see where we go from there.
All right. Thank you, Tess. Any comments from the council? All right. Well, thank you, everyone. A really good, informative meeting. And at this time, I will adjourn the meeting. Have a lovely evening. Bye-bye.